Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is one of my favorite video games ever. I don't have a strict criteria for what counts as my GOAT, but if asked to make a list, then Ninja Theory's Proto-European Vision Quest would easily make the cut. Still, I'm not trying to gush here. I want to balance my enthusiasm with the sober assessment of the subject material, because Senua is different from other historical warriors in games. Her mind is inundated with voices and visions she calls furies, but modern audiences will recognize as hallucinations. Were she alive today, a doctor might diagnose her with schizophrenia.
For my tales of the Northmen, they call me Druth.
The storytelling is simultaneously distressing and understated, constructing Senua's character through the parallel tones of overt horror and rich emotional exploration. The initial marketing focused heavily on Senua's illness, a close look at a severe psychiatric disorder. The actual plot sees Senua journeying north with the head of her murdered lover, Dillion. She seeks a liminal space between the land of the living and Helheim, the land of the dead. Once there, she'll pursue Hela, the northern goddess of death, and plead for the return of Dillion's soul, which she now held after the Northmen sacrificed his body. Only this journey is more hopeful than Senua or the audience might have expected. Despite how hostile the North is, and despite what she must endure to reach Helheim, she regards its trials and legends with a sense of recognition. Even the mysterious and dangerous Hela feels alluring in her familiarity. As Senua fights to stay alive, she can't escape feeling like she belongs here, more than she ever belonged with the Picts, who were always superstitious and hateful toward the young girl with the unnatural visions. Mental health struggles play a major role in Senua's life, but there's a larger conversation about how revelatory her cultural exchange with the North was. Walking among a different people means taking in their belief systems, adopting new attitudes about the world and her place in it. The figures of Northern myth helped her redefine who can function and thrive in a society. Cross-cultural analysis informs all aspects of Hellblade, from the puzzles and combat to the deeper examinations of Senua's identity.
This darkness takes everything. Everyone.
Senua.
Puzzles make up most of the interactivity in Hellblade, as Senua manipulates her environment through the prism of her unique vision. Senua's perception of physical space doesn't make conventional sense, so any forward progress requires her to explore her environment for images and angles that may reveal the path ahead. What results is a suite of creative puzzle challenges. Sometimes a door is magically barred by runes, which Senua must find before she can open that door. These runes exist in obscure configurations around the level, as well as in lights and shadows cast by seemingly random objects. By properly aligning her sight, the shapes reveal themselves, lifting the unnatural barriers. Another common puzzle involves these ornamented archways. Far from being simply decorative, these arches are doors to alternate realities, where objects in view have shifted or changed. Senua may look at a ruined building now, but after peeking through the archway, the same building appears reformed and ready to navigate. These puzzles play off the fragility of Senua's world, demonstrating the instability of what is or isn't there for her to see. Each subsequent puzzle builds on these core ideas with added complexity, positioning Senua correctly in her environment, aligning disparate shapes to create completed images, and layering in different conditions on top of that. Sometimes she moves across time to ascend a massive tower. Sometimes she uses light to keep a trail in a geometrically unreliable space. Other times there's no light at all, and she's left scrounging for anything that even vaguely resembles safety. On top of being mechanically engaging, these puzzles provide a narrative window into Senua's reality, characterizing her in a manner that circumvents common writing cliches.
You found your own way back. All you needed was a little help. A little hope.
There's a tendency in fiction to conflate mental illness or trauma with superpowers, like a person's special ability. These stories often rely on crass stereotypes that perpetuate harmful myths about mental health. For example, how often do you hear that drugs make artists more creative, or that medications destroy your personality, despite myriad evidence to the contrary? I'm glad Hellblade didn't take hacky shortcuts while writing Senua. In real life, hallucinations have no basis in physical reality. There's no empirical meaning to be pieced together from visions or delusions. But in Hellblade, we don't actually know what's real and what isn't. All we have is Senua's perspective. We're not privy to a normal perception of the world that makes Senua's abnormal by comparison.
Because if you believe that Senua's reality is twisted, you must accept that yours might be too.
Without the sane context, there's no evidence that seeing these symbols makes her function better. Honestly, it just seems to make normal tasks 10 times harder. Someone without psychosis may open doors easily, ignoring the random shapes and tedious rituals that preoccupy Senua. The game deliberately withholds a normal perspective to keep the player from othering Senua, categorizing her as crazy and taking her journey less seriously. We have to empathize with her the entire time, to remain in her reality while constantly wondering what's true or what truth even means when all you see is what's in front of you. Navigating with her psychosis feels less like a special ability and more like a social script that exists in the North, a means of functioning that this new society has normalized. Signs and archetypes littering the landscapes are common to Northern culture, well-known motifs to be identified by people with Senua's perception. The puzzles themselves are symbolic of the space this culture has made for people like Senua, whose atypical sensory experience is congruent with Northern expectations. According to the lore stones dotting the land, the Northmen regard the site as a rare yet significant means of understanding reality. The people with the site have helped to shape the North's present and future. Mythic figures like Valravn and Mimir have the site, while Odin, the Allfather, gouged out his eye to see the world as Senua does. While her sight may not accord with empirical reality, it does fit within a northern spiritual context and thus allows her to function accordingly.
He gouged out his own eye as offering to Mimir. He drank from the well and traded one way of seeing for another.
It's fitting that this illusory domain is where she finds a mirror, her first true window into herself. Her own image, unadulterated by the lies of a fearful society. As Senua explores the North further, she has visions of her mother, Galena, hearkening back to the few conversations they had together before she died. The pride Senua felt from surviving the North reached back into her past joys, when Galena rejoiced at her inheriting the site. This vision rekindled the comfort of an old bond and reignited Senua's conviction to speak with Hela. Senua's gaze into the underworld and her communion with departed souls gave her a kinship with the half-rotten goddess of Helheim. The sight prepared her to face down death deified in ways most people couldn't. The Northmen, ever fearful of Ragnarok, performed human sacrifices to ease the dread of dying to Surtr's flames. During Ragnarok, Surtr the fire giant will rise from the inferno of Muspelheim to battle the Aesir gods. The destruction will span every reality, annihilating all life. This devastation is supposedly inevitable and a constant source of fear for the Northmen, who light sacrificial pyres to abate Surtr's wrath and calm their own anxieties. But Senua has already spent her life walking the line between life and death, so when the time came, she faced down her fears and endured Surtr's flames.
Because you cannot overcome suffering if you refuse to look at it.
Face your fears isn't just a vacuous platitude, it's useful folk wisdom that mirrors the psychological science behind treatment for fear-based disorders, like phobias, generalized anxiety, or panic. Avoiding fears through escape or mental suppression validates them in our mind. It reinforces the cognitive behavioral structures behind our fears, teaching us that by running away, we've guaranteed our safety. As avoidance proves reliably effective at circumventing danger, threats of harm begin to generalize. More stimuli signals danger to avoid. Then the fears metastasize, growing more pervasive and intense. Inhibitory learning is the theorized operating principle behind exposure-based treatments. We alleviate pathological fear by associating feared stimuli with outcomes that disconfirm the initial threat. Patients mindfully attend to how their fears do not inevitably lead to irreparable harm. They remain in control even as they're exposed to their fears. Of course, it's not nearly as easy as I made it sound. Inhibitory learning is terrifying, often requires the support of others, and doesn't make the fear go away. But if all goes well, the fear becomes manageable and less debilitating. The man who imparted this wisdom to Senua was named Druth. He escaped capture at the hands of the Northmen by running through the pyre they lit for Surtr. While his captors feared the flames, Druth did not, and confronting that fear when they couldn't ensured his freedom. The trauma of slavery never went away, but sharing his stories with Senua helped him process the pain and gave him a newfound purpose in life.
I die free, knowing you will carry my stories with you. I have fulfilled my quest.
Yes.
Senua took his lessons to heart. She faced the flames, conquered them, and once again steeled herself on her march toward Helheim. But even with this courage, a lifetime of unaddressed traumas left lasting scars on Senua's self-worth and undermined her quest to save Dillion.
Truth? Anyone?
There is no one here but me.
Not you.
After defeating Valravn and Surtr, Senua is confronted with the darkness, a persistently invalidating and ruthlessly demeaning voice risen from deep within her past. He is a loud, lingering specter from the most painful parts of her childhood, come back to isolate her and shatter any resolve she had from her victories. The darkness turns her own mind against her, booming over the other Furies while egging on their cruelty. Her efforts and intentions are chastised as foolish. In this hatred, the darkness returned to blame Senua for Dillion's death. This judgmental patriarch placed the desecration of her lover's body and soul in her hands, just as he had done following the death of her mother. He's convinced Senua that her sight has made her incompatible with society, unable to love anyone without leading them to their deaths. She's better off lashing out at the shadows alone, lest she endanger another life by seeking its affection.
Get up. Get up and fight.
As the darkness coaxes her into this antisocial aggression, now seems like a good time to talk about the combat. Unlike some of my peers, I appreciated Hellblade's departure from the fluid, energetic systems of Heavenly Sword or Enslaved Odyssey to the West. This arduous and disempowering swordplay feels less like Devil May Cry's stylish action and more like Resident Evil's oppressive survival horror. You can't just mash enemies with reckless abandon. Every encounter requires honed situational awareness, effective space management, and judicious application of Senua's viciousness. She must pay close attention to her enemies and scrutinize the details. Without a heads-up display, players have to look at the carnage they inflict or spot the changes in animation. Listen to the sounds of rending flesh, watch as battered Northmen grasp their wounds and stubbornly limp towards Senua. Apply the killing blow when they're weak. Or don't, and just learn to deal with the uncertainty of each seemingly unending fight. Both are valid. This is a horror game, after all.
Pretty capable warrior. Remember your training?
Even as important visual information moves across the screen, Senua's Furies are eager to fill the audio space too. They react wildly to the danger, but their cries have no control or coordination. Each voice shouts as loudly as possible, desperate to be heard over the others. For every Fury that reliably tells Senua to dodge, there are a dozen others that only know how to panic. Sifting through the cacophony distracts and fatigues Senua, a death sentence during the longer fights. The potentially overwhelming combat further characterizes Senua's psychosis. Any information that might help comes alongside a flood of confusion and pandemonium. The small benefit is buried in suffocating noise, making an already stressful activity that much more nerve-wracking. Again, it's hardly a superpower when Senua must either A, become hyper-vigilant to every noise and exhaust herself from sheer mental exertion, or B, Attempt to sort reliable from unreliable voices only to get killed when an unreliable voice finally says something worth hearing. These stressful fights are in keeping with the tone. Hellblade isn't a power fantasy about a warrior goddess. It's a horror story about a deeply disturbed woman crawling through the mud and blood to save her lover. Every drawn-out fight is won by the skin of her teeth, and they all take a heavy toll on her mental health. So much so that Hela shatters Senua's sword and calls her to remember why she picked it up in the first place.
Broken and lost. Just like your sword.
Dillion was Senua's first lover and probably the only loving bond she had since losing her mother. She now carries his head around her waist in the hopes of saving his soul from this strange land. After her encounter with Hela on the bridge, Senua begins receiving visions of Dillion, leading her through a ship graveyard to a sword lodged in a mysterious beachfront tree. To get this sword, Senua must follow these visions of Dillion through 4 mentally demanding shard trials. On top of their challenge as puzzles, these trials look deep into Senua's past, highlighting the tumult that shaped her present. First and foremost, Dillion's kindness is striking. He spoke to her when no one else would, praised her for being a capable warrior, and showed her affection when those around her only offered scorn. He was not repulsed by Senua's proximity to darkness, nor did he recoil from what she described in her visions. Quite the opposite, he gave Senua the confidence to stand up for herself, to self-advocate and not be shamed by her abusive father, Zinbel. On Dillion's encouragement, she explored the world around her and experienced the happiness she'd been deprived of while locked in her father's basement. She nourished her love of flowers, nature, and oral tradition, taking herself on journeys she'd never have imagined. And whenever her thoughts turned dark, her memories of Dillion would lead her back to the light. This profound connection began when Senua and Dillion bonded over his warrior training. What started with tentative glances toward an alluring man became the central activity around which their love blossomed. Wielding a sword, being a warrior grew to symbolize Senua's newfound strength and the affection she felt for the man who helped her find it. Sadly, not all memories evoked by the trials were pleasant ones, and the hard parts of Senua's past stirred up some buried traumas.
Plague. Dillion? Everyone suffered.
Visions of Zinbel appeared, depicting the abuse Senua endured. She was barely allowed to leave her home, kept isolated from the rest of the village by her father. She had to fight for every freedom Zinbel begrudgingly tolerated, and even when she stood up for herself, he still lashed out at her. When the maltreatment wasn't physical, it came as a constant stream of threats and gaslighting. He'd tell her every day that her sight was a curse and that she would only hurt the people around her by defying his will.
Your curse will make everyone suffer. You will have blood on your hands!
These recollections of Zinbel's cruelties paired with the northern legends of vicious family conflicts. King Zigir tried to kill his brother Zigmund, fearing the possibility that he might challenge the throne. A young woman named Hervor robbed the grave of her father Agantir to spite him, not knowing that the sword within his tomb was cursed to kill all those who used it. Senua even heard about the death of the northern god Balder, the youngest son of Odin and Frigg. Or Freya.
I'm confused. I always heard that Balder's mother was Frigg.
Aye, Frigg. Well, that's more of a pet name, you see. It means beloved, something Odin called Freya after they wed.
So, Germanic historical records make a literal distinction between Frigg and Freya, but given their considerable thematic overlap, scholars are divided on whether these two goddesses should be divided. Balder's death was orchestrated by his half-brother Loki, who grew envious of the invulnerability his mother granted his little brother. Frigg withheld that kind of care from her half-giant stepchild, stirring up resentment between the unequal siblings. Loki then found mistletoe, the only thing in the world that could harm Balder, fashioned it into a weapon, and then tricked his blind brother Hodor into killing Balder with it. Afterward, Frigg descended into Helheim, begging Hela to return Balder to life. The goddess of death, Loki's daughter, agreed to return Balder's soul only if every living thing wished him to return as well. It almost happened too, until a giant, believed to be Loki in disguise, said no. This lingering insecurity around death fostered such family strife, from humans to gods. The vulnerability they felt led them to acts of malice and treachery. Loki hated his brother for receiving Frigg's protection, so he got Baldur killed to spite the woman who never loved him as much as she loved her youngest son. When men like Siggeir or Agantyr gave in to their waking dread, they passed that misery onto their families, just as Zynbel projected his mortal terror onto the women in his family. Among the tales of death and betrayal, it's interesting to note the role that cursed weapons play in all of these stories. These weapons grant their wielders acclaim, but always to their detriment. Hervor sought a sword that granted her father victory, not knowing of the curse she would inherit with it. Hodor naively accepted a weapon from Loki, not knowing it would kill Baldur and seal his own fate too. Sigmund famously pulled Odin's sword from the Barnstoker tree, yet for all the battles he won with it, the mighty blade still shattered against Odin's spear when the Allfather came to collect. The shards were reassembled by Sigurd, which Senua then forged into the sword Gramr, a weapon to lead her to Hel.
All she needed was a little help. A little hope.
The northern archetype of the cursed weapon feels less like a genuine warning about dark magics and more like an indictment of the psychological effect of combat. Having this reliable source of power can inspire heroism and leadership, but the mental toll of remaining in battle exhausts them through sheer anxiety. A sword that can conquer any foe will protect you, but it also threatens you with its necessity. Having a weapon implies the need to use it, a constant reminder of the urgency in violence. If you aren't wielding that weapon, then the next man you challenge could be your last. Swing that sword, cut swift and true, and you're safe, but Odin help you if you can't draw fast enough. It's a ruinous state to live in, constant vigilance and a predilection toward aggression, quaking at the thought of an unkillable enemy behind every pair of eyes. It's a state of perpetual terror, a deep primordial fear that Senua is very familiar with. Her sword may help her win any battle, but what happens when the hardest battle is fought in her mind? What happens when the darkness makes an enemy of herself? When she believed her father's threats came true, that her disobedience led to the death of Dillion's father, all that newfound strength she found in combat turned inward and became self-hatred.
She's lost. She doesn't know where she's trying to get to. Is there any escape?
When years of manipulation made her feel responsible for the misfortune that befell her village, her warrior mentality found enemies inside her own mind, and she attacked them mercilessly. The Sea of Corpses was a hideous representation of what Senua put herself through, absorbing the guilt she felt she deserved and giving Galena's image to the suffering. Atop the wailing torment is the reminder that she failed those closest to her, that everyone she ever cared for drowned deep within her darkness.
What hope is there for him, even if his soul could be rescued? Do you think he would thank you for what you have done to him, to his friends, to his father?
This assumption of blame drove Senua to such extremes when Dillion died. Her curse brought this beautiful life to an end, and the guilt of losing another loved one manifested in a desperate bid to save his soul.
No!
What have you done?
No! No!
You've lost him! It's over!
The darkness is back.
She'd cast herself into the darkness to bring him back. Defeating Garm is juxtaposed with Senua writhing in her literal rock bottom. She no longer values her own life, meaningless as it feels without Dillion. Her trauma took his love and used it to drag her back down. This is the true power of the darkness. His sadistic voice forces her to internalize the hatred of Pictish society, to honor the words of the man who abused her.
You have blood on your hands.
The darkness takes the love and vulnerability of an intimate relationship and turns it into a weapon of self-harm. He takes companionship and turns it into failure. So when the darkness returned to Senua, she burned in the flames that once fueled her passion. Only this time, the North has shown her that things don't need to be this way. This other culture has a place for her, taking a nuanced approach to people and supernatural forces they don't immediately understand. They share stories of seers, shapeshifters, inscrutable gods, and battle-scarred warriors, immersing their societies in realities beyond their own eyes. The Northmen still recoil at the abyss of eternity, but to those who see clearly, their gods still have pertinent lessons to teach. Hellblade consistently draws parallels between Senua and Hela, their rotting bodies, their proximity to death, their shared experience of suspicion from others. So even though her methods are unclear, it's not hard to see why Hela took an interest in Senua. This woman who, despite her power and potential, was ready to throw her life away out of misplaced grief. Hela would not bring Dillion back, but she could give Senua what the Picts deprived her of, a life she didn't have to fight for. Hela intervened on Senua's warpath and pushed her toward a path of growth instead. She led Senua to Grammar, showing the ragged warrior how her love and turmoil became intertwined. Hela shared stories of the North through Druth and the Lorestones, showing Senua how the only curse she inherited was a society that feared her. Hela even has Senua look into a mirror again, a reminder that who she sees in her reflection is more real than the curse her father and his congregation have imagined.
They made up monsters to fill the void. That doesn't make them real.
Worse yet, Senua could finally see how far her father went to blind her sight, through the deepest of treacheries and the most malicious of lies.
Turn away, Senua! Turn away, Senua!
The dark mark we see on her skin arose not from sickness or rot, but from charred flesh and smoke. Another innocent life sacrificed to appease the cowardly. Fully comprehending the violence she endured unleashed within Senua a visceral catharsis, a righteous burning anger hot enough to engulf all the deceivers and abusers in Midgard. Alighted by truth, Senua no longer begs for mercy. It's a tough fight, pushing the last of the darkness out, scratching and clawing her way to the final steps of this journey. The echoes of Zynbel's lies grow more desperate as Senua's resolve strengthens. The darkness is easier to cut through than ever. All the terrors it has to draw on fall beneath her rage. But how much longer can she fight, knowing that her journey was forced onto her through deception? It's tempting to keep going, to force Dillion out of the darkness, out of Hela's supposed grasp. The sword gave her her first taste of independence, formed the foundation of her first love. To give up fighting feels like giving up on the man she cherished. Even the player starts to wonder what the reward for continuing might be. What secret, more satisfying ending can they unlock by refusing to lay down their sword? Well, none. This quest was forced upon Senua by the hatred of others, a miasma of lies that grew a sickness of self-loathing in her heart. When those rotten emotions were purged from her body, so too left any reason to lash out at Shatters. It's then, when she finally abandons her quest, finally affirms her own right to exist, that the connection between her and Hela resolves. The half-rotten goddess of death can free Senua from the burden her loss has placed on her, ending a life lived in fear and ushering in the dawn of a kindred soul. This is not a death, nor is it a cure for her psychosis. She still bears the physical wounds earned in battle, and the Furies are still at home in her mind. But after a heartfelt goodbye with Dillion, she meets the embrace of a people who will welcome her. Senua's real story can finally begin. Wow, that sure was a lot of uninterrupted praise, huh? Let's get some criticisms in for a change. I defended the mental health representation before, but there are moments when Hellblade plays fast and loose with its psychosis imagery. It's hard to tell what's a hallucination, a memory, a metaphorical representation of deep anguish, or an actual supernatural event. How severe can a hallucination get in 8th century Pictish society versus one with readily available antipsychotic meds? It feels like some lines were drawn with narrative intent rather than psychological science. The artistic license taken does lend some credence to those who arrived at less charitable interpretations of the story, especially the ending. This is ultimately a minor gripe when compared to the big criticism, lying about the permadeath mechanic. At the start of the game, Hellblade tells players that the rot on Senua's arm will grow each time she dies. If she dies too often, then her quest is over and all progress will be lost. It turned out that there was no permadeath mechanic. The developers added this message to create a gameplay analog for the existential anxiety they believe characterized certain mental illnesses. Let me level with you for a moment. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is and continues to be my favorite game. I've championed its best qualities and defended its shortcomings. I've lauded it non-stop from moment one. So please believe me when I tell you that lying about the permadeath mechanic was the single worst artistic decision I've ever seen in a video game. It's not just that the text animation looks slapdash and aesthetically incongruent. It's that the damn thing actively got in the way of enjoying Hellblade on its own merits. First, it's an immersion killer. Instead of focusing on the story, the lore, the visuals, or Melina Jurgens's stellar acting, players are too busy chasing mechanical perfection lest their time be spent in vain. The permadeath lie didn't threaten players with their mortality. Dying is scary enough on its own. It just threatened to waste their time. As bad as that is, the true crime of the permadeath lie was how it portrayed a lack of confidence in the writing. The personal tragedy alongside mythic illusion, the intimacy of a love story crossed with the turmoil of bereavement. The humanity of a neurodivergent woman articulated through mechanics that inspired empathy. Hellblade was a tale of grief, guilt, and growth. A beautiful tapestry stitched together with stunning environments, horrific battles, and a hopeful resolution. But someone decided that wasn't enough. What Hellblade really needed was the specter of a cheap trick to completely eclipse the conversation and occlude any attempts at good analysis. In the future, I think the team at Ninja Theory should trust in the talent of the writers and programmers, who have already proven that they can organically weave narrative themes through story and mechanics. If the sequel feels the same need to rest on gimmickry, then I will be deeply, deeply disappointed.
I know you. He needs you.
Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice was praised for championing the qualities many AAA game companies gave up on. Self-contained, single-player experiences with bold ideas at a modest price. But even with the commercial goodwill, the game went above and beyond what I and many others probably expected of it. Hellblade did more than simply replicate the symptoms of psychosis. It started a conversation about how mental health functions in a socio-cultural context. So much of Senua's suffering was socially constructed, contrived by small-minded and superstitious people who used their power to punish her for existing. Their ignorance poisoned her upbringing with abuse, grief, and rejection. Her self-hatred came from the discrimination she endured since birth. Senua is strong and ruthless, but she's also kind and self-sacrificing. She's a human being who wants to love and be loved. Her story makes it clear that she shouldn't have to endure the malice of a hateful culture just to prove that humanity to others. Stories like Hellblade's are why I keep coming back to video games. Narratives like Senua's inspire me to think deeply about the medium and to seek other creators with strong ideas behind their mechanics. I made this YouTube channel because of games like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, and I'm glad I finally got to tell the world how much I enjoyed it. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to my channel, and leaving a comment about your time with the game. I hope to see you back soon for other analyses like these.